Good morning, everybody. Welcome to another of the Treescapes seminars. So delighted that you could all join us today. Hope you find it an interesting session. We've got our Treescapes project newLEAF sharing some of their emerging results with us today. So hopefully it's hot off the press. Hopefully you'll find that really interesting. We'll hold questions until the end. So we've got 3 speakers today. So we won't take questions after each speaker. We'll hold it until everybody's done their presentation, and we should have 15 to 20 minutes at the end for questions. But do feel free to put any comments or questions in the chat, and people will respond as we go along, or we'll address those in the Q&A session at the end. So we've got 3 members of the newLEAF team today. We've got Joan Cottrell, David Edwards, and Stephen Cavers. I think Joan is going to go first, followed by David, and then Stephen's going to sum up at the end. I will hand over, first of all, to Joan and let you kick off.
Okay, thank you. I'll just share my screen now. Can you see that?
Yes, that's fine, thanks.
Okay. Okay, so thanks for inviting me to give this talk. I'm mostly going to be scene setting rather than giving a whole lot of new results. And a scene setting about the seed sourcing debate and whether, the background to the evolution of the policy on seed sourcing of native species. Then I'm going to go on to give you a bit about kind of the theory of adaptive evolution, because I think a lot of people, I think a lot of people are terrified of genetics, and I'm going to try and present it quite simply, what our thoughts about adaptive evolution are. And then finally, just in the very last part of the talk, I'll just present some bits and pieces about what newLEAF is doing to try to address some of the gaps in our understanding about adaptive evolution. Okay, so let's get on with the first slide then. So this is just trying to set the scene and the kind of history of policy on seed and plant sourcing for native species. And, well, things were very stable before climate change came on the agenda, and people were pretty clear about what the policy was back in the 1990s, right up till the late 1990s, early 2000s. And it was firmly set in practice notes and the UK forestry standard that recommended using local provenance for native woodlands. And they justified this in order to maintain the genetic integrity of populations of native species. And even for sourcing for timber production of native species, the advice was still pretty clear back in 2005. This is a practice note written by Jason Hubert. So it was clearly source as locally as possible, and you use material from registered seed stands. That's trying to bring in a bit of timber quality into the sourcing, because the seed stands would be kind of phenotypically better timber trees. So the advice there is the first choice British seed stands registered in the selected category from the same region of provenance as the planting site. So that's still local, choose locally. Then if you can't get that, go to other sources, even if they're abroad, as long as they're selected seed stands. And then third choice, come back to Britain and just use a seed source that's not superior in terms of timber. So, and then in 2009, the Reid report was published, and that's one of the first places where I became aware that people were beginning to wonder about the wisdom of local sourcing. And that's a quote from the Reid report: "The preference for use of native tree species and local provenances under all circumstances will need to be reconsidered." So people were starting, this is climate change beginning to impinge on what the policy should be. And then the research note that Duncan Ray and other people wrote acknowledged that the extent and timing of changes to the climate are uncertain, and it's not possible to predict the future climate. So they acknowledged that they don't really know what the future climate will be. They've done a lot of work since then, but we still don't know exactly what the future holds. And one of the measures they suggested was to select planting stock with an origin of 2 degrees latitude south of the site and up to 5 degrees for a small component of mixed provenance stock in species that showed low frost sensitivity. And so the initial advice from climate modelers was to accept or apply the concept of predictive provenancing, or otherwise known as assisted migration, to prepare for climate change. And I'll just go on to the next one. And the current policy, well, before that, there was an awful lot of debate about what we should do. And the geneticists started to favour an evolutionary approach where we use local provenance and take into consideration that those provenances and populations are evolving to climate change. So we shouldn't throw the baby out with the bathwater. We should keep using local and recognise that evolution will occur and they'll become adapted to new conditions. And the current advice is a kind of mixture of the two approaches of predictive provenancing and adaptive, evolutionary approach. So it says, encourage natural regeneration. That's where we're turning over the generations and with the idea that they will adapt to local conditions, even if they change. But also, so they add and select planting stock with an origin up to 2 degrees latitude south of the site and up to 5 degrees south as a small component of mixed provenance stock in species of low frost sensitivity. So it's a bit of a mixture of the two approaches and a bit, it's trying to please everybody, I think. And it's evidence that the climate modelers have taken account of what the people in the evolutionary approach camp have been saying. So why would I argue that it's not a simple matter of just trying to match the current condition? Well, let's read it. Why is it not a simple matter of sourcing stock that originated from a site whose current conditions match those of the future predicted conditions at the planting site? That is, using a predictive provenancing stroke assisted migration approach. So moving stuff northwards, because on the assumption that it will be better adapted to future conditions at more northerly sites. And, well, I think that's slightly oversimplifying things in that this approach, it doesn't take into account the ability of a population to adapt to novel conditions. And we might not need to introduce material from warmer, drier areas if we can work with existing diversity. And that working with existing diversity is a much simpler approach. In that it's easier to source stuff locally than to try to find sites that match in every way to that local site, apart from the temperature and the dryness of the site. And I would argue that it would be good for the climate matchers and the people in the genetic adaptation camp to understand each other a bit better. And they need to, we need to educate people about the concepts of genetic adaptation. So I'm going to attempt to do that very quickly in about 10 minutes. So, genetic diversity provides the building blocks for genetic adaptation in populations. That's how adaptation works. It uses the genetic diversity that exists in our populations. And we know from common garden trials in which we measure various traits in provenances from a wide range of environments, that a single tree population contains a large quantity of genetic diversity itself. And if we look at the distribution of a particular trait across a range of populations, as you can see in that diagram there, the populations, as I said, contain a lot of genetic diversity, most of which is present in all the other populations. And it's only a small amount of unique genetic diversity that's present in a single population. So that's important to remember. There's lots of diversity to work with. And there are two key processes that maintain genetic diversity and promote genetic adaptation. There's gene flow and there's natural selection and genetic adaptation. And these two processes, gene flow and natural selection, tend to counteract each other. And I'll try to explain what I mean by that. So gene flow tends to homogenize populations. It makes them more similar to one another. And the more gene flow you get, the more homogenized populations become. And trees as species are very efficient at maintaining gene flow, and especially long-distance gene flow. For the following reasons: they're tall, their propagules are easily dispersed and designed to disperse over long distances. Trees have high outcrossing rates so that a single mother can have many fathers and can therefore produce very diverse offspring. They've got large population sizes, high recombination rates, which means that the individuals that are produced in a seed crop are very different from one another across a wide range of traits. And as I said, they have high reproductive output. So there's lots of gene flow, both within and beyond a population or a woodland. And it, as I said, it tends to homogenize things. And then natural selection brings about genetic adaptation, and it brings about differentiation. It tends to make populations behave differently from one another. And we investigate that by growing lots of representatives of different populations in common garden trials, and we can see that they behave differently. So there is differentiation occurring at both long distances and in very homogeneous landscapes. It can be over very short distances. And the strongest selection occurs in the first few years of life. So the trees produce vast numbers of offspring, the majority of which do not survive. And it's only those that are suited to a site that survive. We think that adaptation can probably occur quickly in a single generation, but I'll come back to that point. And as I said, we can see that local adaptation occurs from our common garden trials. Populations are genuinely different from one another. And often the differences can be correlated to some factor in the environment. And having said that, we have to note that the patterns of local adaptation can be complex. As I said, they're often determined by some factor in the environment. They're likely to be driven by multiple drivers, and those drivers can be different for different traits, different tree species, and different locations. So it's very difficult to get a whole, complete understanding of what we mean by local adaptation, because it changes depending on species, trait, and location. But we know that it does. There is such a thing as local adaptation. And just to note that a lot of these traits that we are looking at, like height and phenology, they're not controlled by a single gene. They're the product of the action of many genes. And as I said before, the seed crop produces new combinations of these gene sets, so that every seed crop has local and non-local genes in it. So the new genetic material is coming in all the time and allowing natural selection to operate on each cohort of seeds that are produced. Like I said, it produces new gene combinations every generation. Even if there's no gene flow from outside, the woodland can bring the changes within the diversity that exists there. And some genes might have little effect at one location, but be advantageous at another. Or even if conditions change, they may become important in allowing populations to adapt, whereas previously they weren't that important. And so we think that the tree populations can probably respond quickly to change by consistently selecting the currently appropriate individuals, even if conditions change. So from a geneticist's point of view, we would argue that it's a good thing to try to adopt a dynamic local provenancing approach for the following reasons: that there's plenty of diversity to work with from within and beyond the woodland, in that there's pollen flowing into the woodland from populations that are experiencing different selection pressures elsewhere. This approach needs very low-scale intervention. It's conservative in the face of uncertainty. We're not sure what the future will bring. So the dynamic local provenancing approach kind of gives the populations the opportunity to adapt to whatever the future brings. It minimises the risk to native stock in that we're not going to import pests and diseases. It promotes better management as well, so that we can focus on regeneration within populations, so that seed production and regeneration is optimised. And that's good management anyway. And it builds in change and flexibility, in that the woodland has can continuously adapt, even to future challenges that we don't know what they're going to be. For example, new pests and diseases, and we don't know which ones are going to come here. It's practical. It doesn't need large-scale change in planting stock. It's lower cost, and we can start now by monitoring populations to see how well they reproduce and regenerate. We can develop good, reliable seed sources and register seed stands that possibly produce superior timber trees, so we can incorporate the timber production into this approach. And okay, so I'm going to go on to the last bit of my talk, which is what are we doing to fill the gaps in our understanding in newLEAF? And one of the bits that we have least information on is the speed of adaptation, in that people say trees turn over the generations very slowly, and therefore they may not be able to adapt quickly enough, even though we know that they've got plenty of diversity as the raw material for adaptation. So we're trying to look at the speed of adaptation in translocated species, so that we can compare adaptive variation in introduced material and material that is the next generation from that. So if we collect seed from the introduced material and then the seed from the next generation, we can see whether we can detect evidence of genetic change. So we're working with 3 species: lodgepole pine, western hemlock, and Scots pine. And as I said, we've two generations introduced into new environments. And we'll use the seed to establish common garden trials from first generation and second generation material. And then we'll grow them in common garden trials and look at various trait differences in the 2 generations to see if we can detect adaptation, whether any genetic adaptation has occurred in a single generation. And before we set these trials up, we try to think of what's the scenario in which we're most likely to find a change across a generation. And we thought, well, we've brought in a lot of material from North America for our commercial species and grown them in Britain. And those populations are now, they've produced the next generation of seed. And, well, the graph, the diagram, the bottom diagram shows the conditions in which the original source material would be growing in America. That's the green and the blue spots. And in Britain, that's the red spot. Oh, sorry. That's the red spot. And so that if we introduce material from here, they've had quite a different exposure to a very different climate if we grow them in Britain. And so that's one bit of the work we're doing. The other two bits that are kind of pertinent to this talk are we're developing models to incorporate genetic adaptation into climate models, so that this is an attempt to reconcile the predictive provenance and the genetic adaptation approaches, so that we can come together and try to understand those two approaches better. And then the second other bit is that we talk a lot about our forest genetic resource in Britain and how we assume that it's adapted to its local conditions. But how much has that genetic resource been changed through human-mediated activity? How much seed have we brought in from abroad? So how much of our forest genetic resource is truly British and truly adapted to British conditions? And David is going to talk next about that. So I'll hand over to him and I'll stop sharing.
Great. Well, thanks very much, Joan, for setting that up so nicely for me. And good morning, everybody. My name is David Edwards. I work for Forest Research. I've been here for about 20 years or so. And in this project, I'm leading a work package which is answering that question that Joan has just raised. Where have we been getting our planting material from for the last 100 years or so? And what does that tell us about the resilience of our current treescapes? So I'll just get my presentation up on the screen. Is that visible?
That's fine.
Brilliant. So there we go. So these are basically the questions. Where have we sourced our native broadleaf tree seed from for the last, and why? What are the factors that have driven that? And secondly, the so what question. What are the implications of that for resilience and also productivity and the genetic integrity of the tree populations in Britain? Now, I've been focusing on broadleaves, native broadleaves, but in particular, just to start us off, I've been focusing on oak. And there are good reasons for that, which I'll explain. In terms of the big picture, just to sort of understand the 100 years of British forestry, this diagram here sums it all up, really. If you look at our woodland creation over the last 100 years or so, there's this massive increase in production after the Second World War. And that was accompanied by a very impressive increase in efficiency of all operations across the forestry sector. And I'll mention that in a minute because that's quite relevant to this story. The other thing to spot here is diversification from around mid-1980s or so, with the increase in broadleaves, with the broadleaf woodland policy introduced in the mid-80s, and also a shift towards structural diversification as well, which takes us up to the present day. So with that as the background, the question is, where did we get all the seed from? Now, this unfortunately isn't as straightforward as I hoped it was when I agreed to do it 2 years ago. And it's a bit of a jigsaw puzzle exercise, bringing together evidence from a whole range of sources, various databases, annual reports, archival sources, and then ultimately conversations with anyone out there who's retired from the sector, who remembers things in the 70s or even earlier, that we can draw information from and discuss all this with. The first on that list is the one that I've looked at most so far. So right from the very start, when the Forestry Commission was created 100 years ago, every single seed lot that was collected had an identification number with a quantity attached to it for each species, and also the source was recorded. And that data is very nice and clear for the first few decades, and it was published by the FC. And it's a resource that is really invaluable, because you can use this to go and look at what's happening on the ground. And if you have the ID number for a particular forest, you can tell where it actually came from and start linking sources with productivity and resilience. So we're looking at that data and then try to supplement that with the story since the mid-50s. Unfortunately, the system that was used to record and collect this data over the years has changed. It got a bit patchy for a while in the 1960s. But then 1973, when we joined the EEC, there was new forest reproductive material regulations introduced. And from then on, the records are really much, much better. So you see on the right-hand side there, all those green folders are all the master's certificates, which are the documents that we use to record this information all the way up to the present day. So that provides a really nice data set there. The problem really is between the mid-50s and 1973, and that's where we're relying on the kinds of data on the left-hand side there, all these handwritten ledgers, and we're not sure whether we've got them all assembled yet. So the data I've got is a little bit patchy. And that's one of the master certificate documents that the EC require us to fill in for every single seed lot that's collected in Europe and traded, which reveals the quantity and the source of material. So going through that material for oak for the last 100 years, so this is for Quercus robur. This is very provisional, so please don't rely on this as the ultimate findings. This is what we've got. So for the first 30 years or so, there's tons and tons of acorns collected and recorded. And nearly all of that is collected in Great Britain. A little bit is imported. Then around the 60s, you see there's this really big gap in the data, which I think is because we're between two different systems of recording. And then after that, there's much smaller amounts recorded, but a much larger proportion of it is imported. Now, I mentioned efficiency at the beginning, and I think that partly explains why there's so little recorded in the post-war period. I found a quote in the annual reports from the Forestry Commission that said between 1957 and 1972, there was such an improvement in efficiency that they were using 1/10 of the seed to plant the same amount of woodland. So that's just a measure of how efficient things have got in that post-war period as a result of seed quality improvements, better nursery practices and logistics and transport and all the rest of it, storage. So that's the situation for Quercus robur. And then similarly for Quercus petrea, slightly more colourful, you can see the range of countries that we've been imported material from, especially in the post-war period. So overall, some patterns are emerging, and these are supported by the data that I'm pulling out of the Forestry Commission annual reports as well. But what's very useful is that since 2002, again, prompted by European regulations, we've been maintaining a much better database. And so we know the current situation quite well. We know how much seed is collected in Britain. We know how much seed is imported. We also know how many plants are imported. And if you convert the number of plants into tons of seed, then you get a very, very rough estimate of how much we're importing. And it looks like for peduncular oak, it's roughly 8%, but that's very provisional, so please don't quote me. And likewise for sessile oak, it's a little bit more, about 15%. So it's that order of magnitude that's being imported in the last 20 years. Now, I mentioned some of the other data sources, the archival sources that we're drawing on. In forest research, we have a number of containers filled with correspondence and reports from the last few decades, and we're gradually sorting through it all. That's for the whole of FR, and within it all, we've managed to find some data on seed supply, and I've been looking through that. And there are some amazingly interesting folders there filled with correspondence from the 80s and 90s, full of very rich opinions on what should be done about seed supply and sourcing of material, which I haven't been through properly yet, but it's all work in progress. Excuse me. The easy hit in all of this is the FC and FR annual reports for the last 100 years, which often contain data. And here is an example from the mid-50s. You can see at the bottom there that in that year, there were 4,480 pounds of oak were imported from Germany. And there's a little bit of dialogue at the top, which kind of interprets the figures a little bit. So I've been through all of that data. I haven't sort of analyzed the data yet, but I've looked at the comments, and it's beginning to reveal a story. And I'm going to sum that up in a minute. But one thing that those annual reports has revealed is the considerable variation in seed supply between years. So if you look at oak, which is quite extreme actually, because oak can't be stored easily. It's the same with beech, both are recalcitrant. So you have to use it straight away, which creates all kinds of problems with supply. And also you have mast years. So some years you get loads of oak or beech, and other years you just get a failed crop. And so in the annual reports, there's a couple of tables I've shown you here, which just give a sense of how variable it is between years. And I added it all up in the bottom right-hand corner. Abundant and good is about 18 out of 30 years. Poor and failed is 10 out of 30 years. And those are the years when they would have definitely had to import to maintain the supplies that they needed. If you just try and summarize the story over the last 100 years, I've broken it up into 3 parts before I come to some conclusions. And this broadly reflects the data that I showed you earlier. So from the 1920s to the 50s, for oak, it was largely collections from Britain, which the FC was doing on behalf of the public sector and for most of the private sector. And it seems that most of the time we could get what we want. See that quote that I've marked in red. This is quite typical of the period. It's seldom necessary to look outside this island for supplies of oak, ash, or sycamore. Beech is more of a problem. So that was roughly summing up the situation at that period. Then in the post-war period, up until the mid-80s, there is increasing demand from the private sector was developing rapidly. There was more demand for broadleaves in general. And to meet those demands, we had to import more. Now, I can't put a figure on it yet, but very, very roughly, I'm guessing that the answer is going to be somewhere about half of what we use of oak could be imported. But again, that's very provisional. So there's a couple of quotes here that I've marked in red. 1974, the increased call for broadleaf seed and poor crops at home contribute to the very substantial import. And at the bottom, the greater call for broadleaves of British provenance undoubtedly stimulated an increased requirement for seeds by the nursery trade. Because during this time, as all this importing was happening, people were beginning to voice concerns about it and saying we should be getting this stuff from home. Now, that was all partly driven by this 1973 legislation from the European Economic Community, as it was at the time, which required all our imports of most of our forestry tree species to come from registered sources. And since we didn't have many registered sources in Britain, we had to import it from Europe. And that was a big driver for improving our registered seed stands and our seed orchards in Britain over those decades. And then finally, for the last 30 years, as Joan has outlined, there's been this increasing call for local sources. 1990, we had the Rio Declaration, the Convention for Biological Diversity, and from then on, a real shift towards maintaining and conserving genetic resources, and the argument being that it would be better locally adapted for local conditions. And those comments are reflected in some of these quotes here. However, what we also get, as Joan mentioned, is this alternative view that we need to respond to climate change by sourcing from further south, and queries being raised about the idea of local seed sourcing. And that quote at the bottom summarizes both positions, where we should consider sourcing from further south. However, we should acknowledge that that carries risks, and Joan has been outlining some of those earlier. And just to say that those archival sources, as I say, produces a huge amount of interesting correspondence that I haven't been through yet, which really adds some of the kind of nuance and the colour to those statistics that I've been trying to pull together as well. And here is someone in the mid-90s arguing that we're just importing too much and we really need to start focusing on local sources. And there's lots of other alternative opinions being shared at that time as well. So to conclude, because I'm running out of time, to go back to the original questions that I mentioned at the beginning, where have we sourced our broadleaves? Well, to sum it all up, before the Second World War, it was mostly from Britain. Between the Second World War and the 1980s, we're importing a lot more. This is oak that I'm focusing on. And then beyond that, there is a focus again on local. So things have shifted over that period, and it's been driven by mainly by the physiological attributes of oak and beech and other broadleaves. That's the big driver. If we can't get it in Britain, we have to get it from abroad. But also from the regulation, in particular from Europe, which has demanded us to only source from registered stands, plus policy, plus research and development, all the improvements that have been made in storing seed and in establishment techniques and so on. So a rich range of factors that have driven this story. And finally, the so what question. Well, what are the implications of all this? At the end of it all, I think hopefully we'll be able to say something about how much was imported and where it came from and what quality it was. And we can put that in perspective of the entire oak resource in Britain and say whether it's a negligible difference or whether it's quite significant. And that will lead us to some conclusions about genetic integrity, but also just thinking about the actual stands that were grown with this material. We can hopefully say something about its resilience and performance. And if we follow all this up by going into the forest and looking at the performance of trees that have been grown from sources in Europe, for example, I think then it's getting really interesting. So that's all for the future. And as I say, all this is work in progress. So please don't quote any of the figures. It's really just to give an indication of what we're trying to do in newLEAF. Acknowledgements to colleagues in Forestry England who've been invaluable in making all this happen. Okay, I'll stop there and hand over to Stephen to draw it all together.
Thanks, David. Thanks, Joan. Really good presentations, and I hope gives a flavour of the sorts of things we've been looking at and thinking about in newLEAF. Can I just check that? Are you seeing the slides?
Not in slideshow at the moment.
Okay. Is that?
That's
Are you
it.
seeing the right
Perfect.
ones? That the full slides? Yeah.
That's the full slide, yeah.
Okay, great. I will try to be quite brief because I see there are actually a lot of good questions coming up in the chat, and I think it would be nice to have an opportunity to address some of those. So I was really just going to try to draw together a few of the points that David and Joan raised, and really sort of bring it back, I guess, to what both the newLEAF project and the Future of UK Treescapes programme are trying to do, I guess. What we're interested in is resilience of treescapes. So that's partly, we want to expand treescapes, we want to expand tree populations, but we're also interested in how those populations are going to survive into the future. And diversity and resilience are interconnected parts of that question. So it's often said, I think we hear it a lot, that diversity equals resilience. And I did want to just highlight that we should be thinking critically, I think, about this relationship. That we've heard from Joan about the levels of genetic diversity and where that diversity comes from in tree species. We've heard from David about the influence that humans have had on the populations that we've got. We know we've got a lot of genetic diversity out there, and we need to think carefully about what that means in terms of resilience. And it's often said that we should be increasing resilience. We've got to expand, increasing diversity, because that will deliver resilience. But we've got to increase, add to what we've got already, because resilience will undoubtedly result. But actually, we should be thinking about, firstly, does diversity deliver resilience? And I think there is good evidence that that is the case. There's a lot of work being done on that, and we see that systems that have diversity of some kind certainly seem to have an elevated capacity to respond to change. But that isn't unlimited, and particularly when it comes to thinking about things like assisted migration or sourcing new species that we might plant into the country to increase resilience. It comes at some cost as well. That if we increase diversity beyond a certain point, we'll be introducing things that aren't right for the environment that we're trying to plant them into. And actually, therefore, what we should probably be thinking about is asking how much diversity actually delivers the resilience we want. And a lot of what we're trying to do in newLEAF is trying to understand, how do we achieve that balance between diversity and or the diversity we need and a diversity beyond a certain capacity that actually might reduce the quality of the populations that we have. So just I wanted to wrap up with a few takeaway messages. That, as Joan has pointed out, tree species are generally very good at dispersing their genes. That's really what trees have evolved to do. You get fixed in one spot, grow very tall, disperse lots of offspring. That's really what the tree life history strategy is. It's about being able to disperse lots of different options at a landscape, and one or two of those will succeed. And wherever that process is happening, where genes are being dispersed, and there's an opportunity, importantly, for those genes to be recruited into the population, natural selection is happening. So populations are whatever we do, the ones that succeed have been selected by their environment, and that means that change is happening. And we can think about that process, and there are various ways we may be able to interact with it to try and change the pace at which change happens. But then, as David has pointed out, Britain's Treescapes got a long human history, and we are still, well, we've still got a lot to learn about that. There have been good questions in the chat, I think, about, David's documented what's happened in terms of the records of importation of seed into the country. Clearly that goes back further. There may be other sources that were introduced that have gone through a process of being grown here and now actually may be considered local seed sources. That process of movement has happened over many years, and we've got to be aware of it. What I would say is that, we know that importation has happened in various ways over years, but what we haven't really got a good handle on is what the cost has been as we've gone along. So certainly some of them have succeeded, but we have no real measure of how many failed. And that still may be true even in things that were importing today. Excuse me. And it really is something that we need to be looking at in more detail. We need more information about to really understand. And it may be, therefore, that if we compare something that has evolved, adapted locally in situ for many generations with something that's been imported recently, that there's a much higher proportion of the ones that are imported that don't succeed. There may be some that do, but we should be able to measure the cost much more accurately. And the key thing, as has been highlighted by a couple of the questions, is that we're talking about a very uncertain future. And I think part of what motivates us in newLEAF is the discrepancy between the idea that we can make accurate choices about what the future climate can be and therefore select what we're going to plant, and the uncertainty of the forecasts of what's actually coming. And partly that's about uncertainty in future climate forecasting, but it's also because things we don't know about will also come. It may be a new pest or pathogen, it may be a change in a sudden unexpected change in environmental conditions, but trying to predict that's very difficult. And so actually what we may be trying, we may benefit us better in the long run is trying to embed a long-term capacity for change, processes that actually allow expression of that genetic diversity, processes that allow selection and modification of trees for production on a rolling basis. That means that we're always adapting to new conditions and have the capacity to adapt to something new or unexpected as it comes along. And actually, I think that point of view, understanding how we embed that long-term capacity is something that the newLEAF project has got something quite interesting to say about, because we're drawing on ideas from the arts, from social sciences, from long-term records of what the historical record of what's been done to the forest, and bringing that together with the very empirical work on genetics and adaptation. And trying to understand how those two can work together to actually deliver that long-term capacity to respond to change and ensure that memory of what we wanted to happen is retained over a timescale that actually is meaningful for trees. Okay, I'll end there and just say thank you and hand back to Julie.
Great. Thank you, everyone. That was really interesting. And we've got some really great questions, I think, in the chat. I see you've been answering some of them as we've been going along. Um, but there's some I think it would be great to have a discussion about. Um, the first one I'll put to you is from Dan Abrahams, who says woodland resilience is often portrayed as needing to plant trees from southern provenances or novel tree species rather than the ability of existing native trees to be able to provide that resilience through selection and natural colonization. So how do we change that conversation or that emphasis?
I can answer. I don't know if Joan's still there or not, but I mean, I think it's a good question. I think if the question is about how we change the conversation, I think that's an interesting one. I hope the idea that the choice is not as simple as simply moving 2 degrees south to find something that will be adapted to the future. I hope that issue is being resolved and that people understand that it isn't that easy. But in terms of how we change that discussion, I mean, I think that's a whole range of different things about communicating the science to policymakers, trying to get guidance out there, trying to make sure that it's clear to everybody that there are ways that it can be better handled.
Joan, did you want to come in on that as well?
Yes, I agree. I think, well, I was saying recently that it's very difficult to get these ideas across because they're complex ideas, and the assisted migration idea is a much simpler concept to grasp. You get a map, you show the climate on the map, and you show what the predicted climate in Britain is, and it's simple. Whereas genetic adaptation is quite a difficult concept, and we have been trying very hard to get that concept across, but I don't know whether we're succeeding or not. I don't know if that answers the question.
Yeah, is there any comments from anybody in the audience? Any thoughts on this question?
And lots of people just say, "Oh, we don't understand genetics," and that's the blinds come down and makes
Hi,
it.
it's Dan Abraham.
Oh,
Dan
hi.
Abraham. I asked the question from Natural England, one of the woodland specialists. Yeah, I think Joan said, it appears quite complex, but I'm not sure it is that complex actually, because I think the speakers today have shown that in spades, really, that you can speak about genetics to non-geneticists and they can understand it. Then I think it's the concepts probably aren't that complex and easily understood. But yeah, I think there is a real issue in sort of like trying to get the science into the policy and just raise the awareness more about the role of natural selection and regeneration, because I think there is a tendency to and I referred to it in my question, but there is a tendency to just go for what appears to be the easy fix, which is just grabbing trees from further south and sticking them in the ground, which I think from the messages today is not the right way not the right approach going forward. So I think in Natural England we've been banging on about natural colonization for a long time, but as yet it's not really taken traction an awful lot in terms of the resilience conversation.
Thanks. Okay, any other questions or comments from the floor? If you've put a comment in the chat, feel free to ask it to the panel. Otherwise, I'll just pick out some of the ones in the chat. Okay. So Tim Peters was asking, is it possible that a local adaptation is produced by epigenetic changes rather than traditional generational genetics? And if so, does the provenance make any difference? Stephen, you did put an answer in there. Did you want to add anything to that?
I can re-emphasize the answer if you like. I mean, I think epigenetics is certainly likely to be part of the equation. And well, there's another Treescapes project, so Membra are actually looking explicitly at epigenetics, and it's certainly, you know, we do see things in terms of how individuals grow in response to the way that they're raised during their early life, for example, that are likely to be epigenetic effects. But I would say that, you know, the experiments we do, the work we do is about measuring the genetic part of the difference between provenances. And we do find that, I mean, there is definitely a genetic part. You know, there's fundamentally something different about provenances in, well, we can find differences amongst provenances, certainly, that is genetic. And so we do think provenance makes a difference. And that certainly fits the kind of, you know, evolutionary model that we would expect to see as things respond to the environment that they grow in.
Okay, thank you. Rhiannon, if you're still on the line, would you like to ask your question about natural regen and seedling success rates?
Yeah, sure. So my question was mainly around what does the scale look like from the previous graphs in the second talk about looking at how much of our seed is imported. Just a question for the researchers, if there's any sort of comparison to the rates of natural regen in the country already, so that we can understand planted versus natural regen and how much of a sort of share of the total that represents.
I think that's an excellent question, and I'll be looking for data sets on that. I remember I was in a seminar on continuous cover forestry recently, and they were struggling to get any data on that and on how much CCF had been done over the last few decades. I don't think the data is perhaps that readily available, but that's part of the mix. And if we can find that, I think it would be really helpful. Thank you.
Thanks. And then Vadim, you raise an interesting point about whether we're in normal or non-normal circumstances. Probably agree, but we're in a rapidly changing climate. And so you are asking whether natural adaptation could occur at the rate that is required. And I think, Stephen, you responded to say that you're seeing potential adaptation within one generation. So I don't know if you want to add to that in terms of is that quick enough? Can't expect more than that, I suppose.
Yeah, I think that is the answer. We do see change, and I mean it's something that's documented. You know, there are publications on the difference between generations. It's what tree improvement and you know, that it's what that process is doing. Exactly whether or not it can happen fast enough is a question we're trying to answer with the newLEAF project. I think the rate of change will vary a lot depending on the type of forest that we're talking about. It's going to be different in, you know, a forest which is being managed for conservation, for example, where the rate of turnover in the population might be lower. But in forestry, I guess in principle, it can be as fast as you're willing to harvest a crop and replant. So it may be much quicker in those situations, but yeah, it will vary a lot. But we think it could happen reasonably quickly. Is that enough of a hedged answer?
Yeah, I think so. Is that okay for you, Vadim?
Somebody asked why we were using exotic species to examine that, and well, we thought a lot about that before we set up the trials and the experiments that we decided on. And we thought, well, it possibly is going to be very difficult to detect intergenerational change. So if we kind of maximize the difference in the conditions between the two generations, then that's the way we're going to most likely detect it. So bringing an exotic species into Britain and allowing it to reproduce here and then to compare the generations, we thought was the most likely we would be able to detect a difference. So if we detect a huge difference, then we might go to more subtle experiments. But we thought it was better to look for a big change first and to see if we can detect that.
I've got a question. Oh, sorry, it might be a silly question, but you said that you were going to be doing 2 generations, testing 2 generations. And the species that how long does it take for each generation to get to sexual maturity? So in order to allow you to do that, is it, in the species that you're looking at, is it fairly rapid? Obviously, some species takes a lot longer.
Yes, well, I wouldn't say it was easy to find the right material. It was a challenge for the reason that you're alluding to. But we did manage to find suitable populations in order to test our theory.
Okay.
But yes, we were.
Yeah, it sounds quite challenging.
Yes, we were worried at the beginning.
But it's a really good point, Julie, that it varies a lot with species.
Yeah.
So, something like juniper can be reproductively mature in 2 or 3 years. Something like Sitka spruce can take 25 years. We're working with lodgepole pine partly because it's only a decade. So, in a reasonably short period of time, you can have a generation produced that's already producing offspring. So, that was part of the complexity of what we had to try and find.
Thanks. Okay. We've got a few more minutes. Peter asked, he made a comment about the estate woodlands of the 18th and 19th century, which he said must have been importing seed like larch. So they would have been a good source for seed collections, and makes the comment that some homegrown oaks could well have a non-British origin.
Yeah,
do you want to come in on that point?
I didn't mention that, but that's definitely, again, part of the mix. I think, some of the registered seed stands in Forest of Dean or New Forest, which were used for decades and decades, quite well have been planted up with oak from Germany or somewhere. And so if anyone's got any data or evidence on this, please do get in touch, because I've just had a quick look through some old books on history of forests and haven't found a great deal yet. But definitely that's a factor.
David, are you aware of Andrew Hackett Payne's fellowship, the Treescapes fellowship, who's looking at seed and masting across Europe? He did a presentation last week, and I think it ties into the next comment around that maybe we couldn't always rely on imports, because when there's a poor year in the UK, it's across Europe as well. And Andrew's work, he's been mapping that, and it's quite interesting to see that there's big regional areas. Masting occurs at the same time, and then the poor years occur at the same time. I don't know if you've got any of that data and you're feeding that into what you're doing as well.
I do remember that he gave a presentation, I think, at the Treescapes conference. I remember that. And definitely should get in touch with him. I think that it's true that, if there's a bad mast year here, then it's possibly the case in much of Europe. But and every European country is then trying to source material from the few sources there are. And yet, it isn't black and white. There's enough patchiness in it all for people to get some of the imports that they need. Because this is reported every single year in the annual reports. They're almost obsessed with this question of where to get it from. So there's always a bit of commentary that describes whether or not it was a problem in Europe as well.
Mm. Yeah, I think he'd be really interested in what you're doing. It ties in really nicely with
I
that
see
piece of
it's
work.
here
He's
with us.
actually
Yes,
finished. Oh, are you here, Andrew?
Yeah,
You
it's
can,
just
I'll get in
messaged.
touch with you.
sorry, yeah, you can correct me if I've got it wrong.
No, not at all. And actually, yeah, David, I've just written an email to you, so we'll get in touch about
Perfect.
Perfect. Look forward to it. Thank you.
Great stuff. Okay. So Kevin is asking, is it quite a step change to manage create forest through natural processes? So natural regen colonization. That's a big question, Kevin.
I think Kevin knows more about that question, probably. And it's challenging to do that.
Yeah.
And we need to manage our woodlands in order to do that. We can't just neglect them and expect them to get on with it. We have to, encourage regeneration by creating gaps and managing our woodlands, and possibly promoting doing things to the trees to promote seed production if they're not that great at, and people are trying to understand seed production much better. So there's lots of challenges there. Deny that.
And Chris Nichols, I think you're raising another challenge, another issue here about where do we draw the line for risk? So is it riskier to rely on existing genetic diversity in the face of changing climate, or more risky to potentially allow more pests and diseases to come in? This is a difficult question to answer.
Well, we haven't really spoken about how difficult it would be to do the assisted migration, in that you're trying to find seed sources that exactly match the conditions of your home site, except for temperature and drought. Well, you've got to match a million other features of the environment if you're going to do it properly. And the nursery trade is not very ready to be raising such specific seed crops as that. It's hugely challenging to do it. And if you don't do it properly, you'll end up with really badly adapted material, planting material. So there are dangers involved in it, apart from introducing pests and diseases. I mean, it's the whole practical, how on earth do you do it properly?
Yeah. I think there is a risk in just indiscriminate sourcing from further south without taking that into account, and that is what might happen in practice if people don't appreciate that it's a lot more than just a couple of variables that are involved.
And we don't know what the drivers of all the traits in a tree are, but they vary according to species, according to what the planting site is. There'd be a different driver depending what the planting site is, and also the seed source site as well. And it'll be different for different traits. So it's a very big, that's what newLEAF is trying to tackle, is uncertainty. And that is, all those aspects are very uncertain.
But just to add to that, is there a case for sort of land managers working closely with research colleagues, such as yourselves, Joan and Stephen, to source material that is properly matched in sites in Britain where there might be a big drought risk, for example, and to really try and do the climate matching properly?
Yes, with soils and which diseases they might be adapted to. You'd have to do it much more extensively than just the two climate characters that they currently use. But the predictive provenancing is based on, well, it's temperature and
rainfall.
And there's a lot of other things affect a site.
Okay, thank you. We are out of time just about. There's plenty more comments and questions in the chat, so do feel free to carry on responding to those once this meeting's ended. But thank you so much to our newLEAF presenters for a really interesting and thought-provoking presentation, I think, and some great sort of discussion going on there. So hopefully you found that interesting. Do feel free to get in touch with our newLEAF researchers if you've got further questions or you want to find out more about what they're doing. I'm sure they'd be happy to talk to you. So thank you, everyone, and have a good rest of the day.